Immediately after any tragedy involving a firearm, we hear calls for more gun control, despite the fact that none of the proposed measures could ever have prevented or even mitigated that event. Now, some are swayed by the emotional argument, but each time we also see a myriad of seemingly logic-based anti-gun arguments. Now, these come in the form of studies and reports funded or conducted by anti-gun groups, and by tried and tired arguments that those of us who have been following for a while just roll our eyes at. But these can sway the uninitiated, and that's why I would like to discuss them now. A study concerning Connecticut's firearm licensing law was recently published in the American Journal of Public Health. This study was conducted by the Bloomberg School of Public Health. In 1995, Connecticut implemented a handgun licensing law. The study states that in the 10 years following implementation of the law, Connecticut's firearm homicide rate fell by 40%. Now, this is true, but the dates that they chose can't be a coincidence, and a broader view makes it impossible to argue that the drop was the result of the handgun licensing law. You see, while it's true that Connecticut's firearm homicide rate did drop an average of 4% per year in the 10 years following the law, that same rate dropped an average of 15% per year in the 2 years prior to the law. And you can see that in the study's own charts. And why did they choose to stop at 2005 when final data was available through 2012? Well, if you look at 95 to 2012, you find that Connecticut's murder rates did not drop any more than the U.S. as a whole, most of which does not have handgun licensing. You see, murder rates have been dropping dramatically over the last 20 years all over the country, and Connecticut is no example. But Connecticut hasn't done any better than the rest of the country or even the rest of New England. And there was not any positive change in the trend after the law was enacted. So while the data in the report is accurate, the conclusion that the drop was due to handgun licensing is absolutely unsupportable. A recent study from the Violence Policy Center has concluded that defensive handgun use is a myth. They reached this conclusion by pointing out that in 2012 there were only 259 justifiable firearm homicides by non-police officers, and there were 8,342 criminal firearm homicides. Now, setting aside that the Violence Policy Center is an anti-gun group and that no study of theirs has ever survived peer review, they do get a lot of media attention. So I'll address the claim. The obvious flaw in this study is that they conflate defensive use of a gun with justifiable homicide. Clearly, you can defend yourself with a gun without killing the criminal. But more on that later. Now, I found 13 studies that estimate the number of defensive gun uses per year in the United States. Those numbers range from 108,000 to 4.7 million. With the only number coming in lower being from the Violence Policy Center itself. Now, the lowest of the legitimate numbers, 108,000, still exceeds the combined firearm injury and death as reported by the CDC. Let me say that again. The lowest estimate of defensive gun use in the U.S. still exceeds the total number of all firearm injuries and deaths combined. So how could we have so many defensive gun uses and so few justifiable homicides? Well, first, as recently noted by the press concerning police shootings, justifiable homicides consistently go underreported. This is because in the FBI's Unified Crime Statistics, the circumstance of a homicide is considered supplemental information and is reported on a different form. Now, if a department doesn't fill out that form, and many don't, then the homicide is assumed to be criminal rather than justified. Secondly, many departments don't change or recode the information when a homicide is later found to be justified in court. A much bigger factor is that very few defensive gun uses actually involve pulling the trigger, let alone killing somebody. I've found 4 studies that estimate the number of defensive gun uses where the attack is averted merely by brandishing. These range from a no-fire rate of 76% to 98%. So the vast majority of defensive gun uses do not involve the discharge of the firearm. Of those remaining, there are many, many reports of the gun being fired, but nobody being hit. And there are some more reports of the gun being fired and the criminal being wounded, but not killed. All of this supports the conclusion that a very, very small percentage of defensive gun uses result in a justifiable homicide. Of course, that stands to reason, unless you work for the VPC.